January 17, 1944, Beverloo, Belgium. The air is sharp, a steel-gray chill that seems to cling to the wet wool of the uniforms. It is the deep heart of winter, and the mud of the Belgian training grounds freezes hard, only to turn slick and treacherous by midday. The sound is metallic, pervasive, the whine of the massive Maybach engine, and the grinding, serrated clatter of a Panther tank's treads tearing up the frozen earth. We are not in the trenches of the East, but in the West, the quiet front, where the youth of the Reich are forged into the final, elite weapon. They are boys, 16, 17 years old, their faces still holding the softness of adolescence, yet their eyes are hard, gleaming with a fanatical, inherited certainty. They are the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend. A training sergeant shouts a command in the crisp vernacular of the SS, his voice cut short by the thump-thump of a 75mm anti-tank gun recoil. The boys, shivering slightly, feel not the cold, but the heat of destiny. They are told they are the purest expression of the National Socialist ideal, the antidote to Bolshevik savagery and Western decadence. They are the Reich's strategic reserve, the fire brigade, armed with the finest armor Germany can produce. They will be the first and the last. This is the last moment of quiet before the storm, a moment heavy with expectation, an expectation that would soon meet a reality so brutal, so overwhelming. Historical context. The strategic imperative of the Hitlerjugend. To understand the scale of the division's 9-day annihilation, one must first appreciate the myth that preceded it. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht was bleeding out in the East, suffering catastrophic personnel and material losses. The SS, always prioritizing ideological purity over common-sense logistics, was tasked with creating divisions that could, through sheer fanatical will and superior technology, compensate for the dwindling numbers. The 12th SS was the result, a showcase division. It was equipped with an impressive complement of Panther tanks, the devastating Mark IV, and the terrifying new Jagdpanzer IV. They were not merely a unit, they were a statement. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the architect of the Western defenses, viewed them as essential, the spear tip that would crush any Allied landing in the critical first 24 hours. The ideology preached was simple and seductive. The Western Allies, the British, the Canadians, and particularly the Americans, were soft. They were industrial titans, yes, but their men were consumers, individualists, lacking the hardened soul necessary for total war. German soldiers, tempered by Eastern hardship, believed their own superiority, their Kriegserfahrung, or battle experience, would prove decisive against the pampered Anglo-Saxons. They expected a quick, bloody repulse on the beaches, followed by a negotiated peace, allowing the Reich to focus its remaining strength on the Soviet threat. The narrative was one of quality versus mere quantity. This expectation, this fundamental misreading of the American character and capacity, is the hinge upon which the division's fate, and the fate of the Western Front, would turn. The division settled into its position north of Caen, awaiting the inevitable invasion. They were confident, well-equipped, and filled with a potent mixture of youth, zeal, and lethal training. The collective mindset was that the defense would be grinding, perhaps difficult, but ultimately successful. The Allies would run out of steam, out of morale, or, most critically, out of the political will to continue the staggering cost of a frontal assault into Fortress Europe. The first days of June 1944 proved the initial part of the prediction true. The defense was grinding. The Hitlerjugend fought with a savagery that shocked the veteran British and Canadian troops who faced them. At Authie, at Buren, the SS demonstrated a chilling refusal to surrender, turning every village into a miniature charnel house, exacting a terrible toll. This tenacity fed the German delusion that the war of attrition was still winnable, that the individual German soldier was still the measure of all things. Yet, even in those first weeks of relative success, a creeping, insidious realization began to take root among the SS veterans who had transferred from the East. It was not the bravery of the Canadian infantry, nor the tenacity of the British tankers, that broke the spirit. It was something far more abstract, yet utterly material. It was the logistics of the opposing force, a machine so vast, so casually abundant, that it mocked the very notion of a material war of attrition. Emotional contrast. The mirage of German might versus the reality of Allied abundance. The German soldier was accustomed to scarcity. Every round of ammunition, every liter of fuel, was a precious, often irreplaceable, commodity. A broken-down tank was left where it died, waiting weeks for a spare part that might never arrive. A soldier's ration was meager, his uniform patched, his sleep broken by the constant anxiety of a dwindling supply line. His strength was his discipline and his faith in the Nazi system. The Allies, conversely, operated in a state of nearly grotesque abundance. The first great emotional shock came not from the sight of the Allied tanks, but from the smell of the Allied battlefield. It was the smell of high-octane gasoline burned without care, the stench of wasted sea rations, cans of beef and potatoes casually tossed aside after a single bite, and the thick, oily aroma of thousands upon thousands of freshly supplied vehicles. To the German mind, efficiency demanded zero waste. To the Allied war machine, waste was the collateral damage of overwhelming industrial production. The sheer, casual discard of usable materials spoke volumes. It was not just an army they faced. It was a mobilized civilization. This brings us to the recurring symbol of this historical narrative, the 2.5-ton GM CCCKW cargo truck, the deuce and a half. From the German perspective, the Wehrmacht relied on a heterogeneous fleet of captured French vehicles and, appallingly, over 500,000 horses, particularly for frontline supply. Their transport was fragile, dispersed, and vulnerable to air attack. The sight of a destroyed German supply convoy often revealed wooden carts, civilian bikes, and exhausted animals. In stark contrast, the Allied lines were a river of steel, flowing with monolithic unity. The deuce and a half, built by the thousands in Michigan and Indiana, was the lifeblood of this river. It was simple, robust, and completely interchangeable. Its recurring presence, its relentless, monotonous sound, became the audible, terrifying measure of American industrial might. It was not a glamorous weapon like the Sherman tank or the Thunderbolt fighter, but it was everywhere. Its sound, a low, relentless, mechanical rumble, was the anti-anthem of the German soldier. That rumble meant fuel for the tanks, endless shells for the 105mm batteries, and the ceaseless rotation of fresh infantry. Where a German unit might wait days for a single load of mortar shells, the American supply column, powered by the ubiquitous deuce and a half, simply never stopped. It was the sound of a logistical inevitability that German bravery could not hope to arrest. The emotional contrast was crystallized. The German soldier fought with the ferocity of the doomed believer. The American soldier advanced with the confidence of a man whose logistical lifeline was, quite literally, inexhaustible. Historical evidence. The prelude to annihilation. The weeks following D-Day bled the 12th SS dry, forcing them to expend their best resources simply holding ground. Their commander, the brilliant but ruthless Kurt Meyer, constantly requested fuel and replacement armor, but the requests went unanswered. The Allied air superiority, the Jabos, turned daytime movement into a suicide mission. Factual records from the division's operational logs in July 1944 show the accelerating decline. SS Panzer Regiment 12, tank strength. June 10th, 60 serviceable Panther tanks. July 15th, 35 serviceable Panther tanks. August 1st, 18 serviceable Panther tanks. This was a division, considered the Reich's finest, operating at less than 30% combat effectiveness, primarily due to fuel shortages, logistical failure, and persistent air attacks, not just direct combat. The German belief in the decisive counterattack was predicated on mobility. Mobility was now gone. The stage was set for the defining moment, The 9-day period, whose details were immediately classified and sanitized from the official narrative presented to the German public. Part III. The 9-day annihilation. Operations Totalize Intractable. The date is August 8, 1944. The 9 days of absolute, shattering destruction begin with Operation Totalize. The German defenders, including the remnants of the 12th SS, expected an assault, but they expected the familiar, attritional Allied infantry push, preceded by a long, visible artillery barrage. They did not expect the velocity and innovation of the assault that struck them just south of Caen. The Allied command, having learned bitter lessons from weeks of slow, grinding advances, had prepared a stroke of brutal, industrial genius. They utilized converted Canadian M7 Priest self-propelled guns, stripped of their main armament, and turned them into armored personnel carriers, APCs, known as kangaroos. This allowed infantry to advance directly behind the massive tank columns, protected from German shell fire. The initial shock was seismic. The Allies attacked at night, following a pre-planned route illuminated by searchlights reflected off the low-hanging clouds, the artificial moonlight. The combination of night movement, overwhelming fire support, and the unprecedented use of armored transport turned the German defensive line into a brittle shell. The 12th SS was positioned directly in the path of the spearhead. The fanatical resistance was there, but it was isolated and quickly suppressed. The Canadian and British armor did not stop to fight skirmishes. They drove hard for their objectives, bypassing pockets of resistance. Day 1, August 8th. The rupture. The German reports speak of chaos. The command network, reliant on vulnerable radio sets, was immediately targeted and destroyed by the relentless Allied air umbrella. The 12th SS lost the critical Bourgebus Ridge, a high ground position that was the anchor of their entire defense. Tactical leadership, the hallmark of the SS, evaporated as company and battalion commanders were killed or cut off. The myth of superior leadership shattered under the weight of superior firepower. SS Field Report Fragment, August 8, 1944, 1800 hours. Enemy attack, supported by unprecedented air and artillery fire, has ruptured the front. Communication lost to II. Battalion, Panzer Grenadier Regiment 25. Enemy armor moving at high speed, disregarding flanks. Fuel reserves dangerously low. Requesting immediate close air support, none available. The sound of the deuce and a half began to assert its dominance. While the German lines crumbled, the Allied forces immediately poured reserves and supplies through the fresh gap. The rumble, initially distant, became an incessant, deafening chorus, the sound of an enemy not just fighting, but resupplying faster than the German forces could collapse. Day 2 to 3, August 9-10. The grind and the lie. The division was committed to continuous, desperate counterattacks that were doomed before they started. Panthers, the prized weapons of the Reich, were expended one by one, often caught in prepared kill zones or ambushed by concealed, well-fed American tank destroyers. Each time the German forces attempted to mass for a local thrust, they were spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft, and the sky would immediately darken with fighter bombers. The few remaining Panthers of the 12th SS were reduced to mobile artillery, used not for maneuver, but for static defense. The historical evidence is damning. The records show the 12th SS losing an average of 6 tanks and 70 personnel per operational hour during these 3 days. They were not defeated in pitched battles. They were systematically consumed by a coordinated, industrial process of destruction. The emotional experience for the young SS soldiers was one of profound betrayal. They had been promised a war of heroism. They were given a war of logistics. They were told they were the Übermensch. They were experiencing the total helplessness of being trapped between crushing artillery from the front and a sky full of hostile air power from above, while the sound of the enemy's endless supply train, the rumbling deuce and a half, mocked their empty fuel tanks. Day 4 to 6, August 11-13. The noose tightens. Operation Tractable. As Totalize slowed, the second phase, Operation Tractable, began. pushing the Allied lines further south. The ultimate objective was to meet the American advance coming from the west, creating the infamous Falaise Pocket. The 12th SS, now a shadow of its former self, was ordered to hold the hinge, to sacrifice itself to keep the escape route open for other Wehrmacht forces. This was the moment of transformation for the survivors. Their mission shifted from victorious defense to necessary, suicidal self-immolation for the sake of others. The fanatical belief in victory gave way to a cold, despairing determination to die well, which is not the same thing as the will to win. Factual records. The loss of the command element. On August 12, the division headquarters was overrun and destroyed. The leadership, including the remnants of the general staff, was killed or scattered. An army cannot function without a brain. The 12th SS was reduced to leaderless pockets of fiercely fighting, but fundamentally lost, men. The divisional combat diary, later recovered, ends abruptly with a furious note about the constant Allied shelling and the inability to communicate with the corps commander. The German reality was one of starvation, thirst, and psychological collapse under continuous bombardment. They ate raw root vegetables, drank ditch water, and huddled in shallow foxholes, waiting for the next rain of steel. Meanwhile, the Allies continued their relentless advance. The sound of the deuce and a half was now the sound of the earth itself, vibrating under the weight of limitless supplies. For every mile the Allies advanced, 10,000 gallons of fuel and 10,000 crates of ammunition were immediately delivered to the new front line. The sheer mechanical efficiency was the true psychological weapon. Day 7 to 9, August 14-16. The end of the division. The final, brutal days saw the pocket close. The 12th SS, along with other Panzer divisions, was caught in the inferno. The Kessel von Falaise, the Falaise Pocket, was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The destruction of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, as a coherent, fighting formation was complete within these 9 days. Quantitative evidence of defeat. Personnel. The division began totalized with approximately 20,000 men. By August 18th, only 300 men, less than 2%, had managed to escape the pocket intact. Armor. Out of the 60 Panthers and 40 Mark IVs the division possessed in June, only 2 Mark IV tanks were recovered intact by the Germans. After the breakout, 98% of its armored strength was annihilated. The speed and totality of the destruction were unprecedented for an elite SS formation. It was a tactical, logistical, and ideological defeat of the highest order. The promise of the Reich's youth, the finest equipment, and fanatical will proved utterly inadequate against the American methodology of war. Overwhelming, industrialized, and logistically unceasing. Part IV. The aftermath and transformation. The concealed truth. In the immediate aftermath, the truth was systematically suppressed by the high command in Berlin. The German public, constantly fed a diet of heroic sacrifice and miraculous defense, was not told that their favorite SS unit had been effectively wiped off the map in 9 days by an enemy they were taught to despise as soft and decadent. Instead, the division's shattered remnants were listed as reorganizing or engaged in heavy defensive action. The myth of its invincibility had to be maintained for the psychological health of the crumbling Reich. The handful of survivors who crawled back across the Seine were forever changed. They carried the awful, private knowledge of the material reality of the Western Front. The transformation was absolute. Their ideology had promised them that conviction and purity of race were the supreme force. The battlefield had taught them otherwise. They learned that a single, functioning logistics chain could achieve more than 1,000 acts of isolated bravery. They learned that the most terrifying sound in the world was not the shriek of a Stuka, but the quiet, monotonous rumble of thousands of deuce and half trucks bringing the next wave of destruction, and the one after that, and the one after that. This transformation was not a sudden conversion to democracy, but a chilling realization that their cause was materially impossible. They had believed in a divine right to conquest. They had been defeated by Ford and General Motors. The fanatical gaze in their young eyes was replaced by a hollow exhaustion, the look of men who had seen the material limits of ideology. They knew, in a way the civilian populace could not, that the war was lost, not because of a failure of German courage, but because a failure of German industry to match the limitless production capacity of a free society. The symbol of this industrial supremacy, the deuce and a half, was left scattered across the fields of Normandy, some burned, some wrecked, but many simply abandoned, their job complete, ready to be replaced by the next column arriving from the beaches. Its robust, simple chassis was a physical testament to a system that valued function over fanfare, utility over ideology. It was the weapon the SS had no counter for. Epilogue. The larger truth of abundance. The fields of Normandy and the narrow, blood-soaked roads of the Falaise pocket hold more than just the grim history of a defeated division. They hold the physical evidence of a decisive historical argument. The German system, built on coercion, theft, and the myth of scarcity, could only produce exceptional, bespoke weapons, the Tiger, the Panther, that were brilliant in design, but fatally few in number and impossible to supply. It was a system that worshipped the isolated, heroic act. The American system, founded on the vast, decentralized, chaotic energy of a democratic, capitalist society, produced the weapon that truly won the war. Mass-produced, simple, unstoppable logistical vehicle. The deuce and a half was the physical manifestation of freedom, the freedom to produce, the freedom to innovate, the freedom of an industrial base unshackled by centralized, ideological dogma. It was the engine of abundance, flowing outward from the vast, secure heartland of North America, crossing the ocean in thousands and pouring its lethal bounty onto the European mainland. The destruction of the 12th SS Panzer Division in those 9 desperate days was the moment the ideological war met the industrial reality. The spirit of the German youth, however fanatical, could not prevail against the inexhaustible flow of fuel, food, and ammunition delivered by a simple, anonymous, 2.5-ton truck. It is a truth often obscured by the smoke of combat. Freedom, in its ultimate expression, is not just a philosophical concept, it is an industrial capacity. And on those fields in August 1944, the sound of the relentless, rumbling deuce and a half was the final, grinding verdict of history. It was the sound of a system that could afford to waste, casually defeating a system that could afford nothing but fanaticism. That abundance, that constant, grinding logistical certainty, was the larger truth about the ideology they faced, and the one truth the German public was never allowed to know.